Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Objectively speaking, what is called the Iran nuclear deal is a milestone for non-proliferation and diplomacy. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran is in compliance with the agreement signed during the Obama administration. Donald Trump knows this, so why does he want to trash the agreement? Cross-talking the Iran deal, I'm joined by my guest, Rouzbeh Alabadi in Pittsburgh. He is a partner at Global Growth Advisors, international strategic consultancy group based in New York. And in London, we cross to Mahan Abedin. He's an Iran expert at Middle East Eye. Our gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Rouzbeh, in Pittsburgh, if I can go to you first here. One of the things I'd like to focus on this program, we know that, I guess it's common knowledge now that Donald Trump is going to decertify this agreement. And looking at the mainstream media, looking at all the cable stations, it's remarkably light on facts. Like, for example, the IAEA saying that Iran is in compliance with this agreement. But we hear about all this other stuff on the sides, Iran's behavior in the Middle East and its other activities in the region. But if I can remember correctly, one of the reasons I wanted to focus just on the nuclear side of things is because it was doable. This wasn't an agreement to solve all problems in the Middle East. And I think this myopia that we have in the policy ranks surrounding the President of the United States and in Congress here fail to understand that this is a good agreement. And I'm not someone that was a big fan of Obama foreign policy, and I feel the consequences of walking away from it could be very, very dangerous. Go ahead in Pittsburgh.
You're right, Peter. It would be a catastrophe. It would be a foreign policy catastrophe for the United States. And also it would be a security catastrophe for the broader region. If this escalates, it will escalate if it goes on this path. But let's remember, the reason the JCPOA, or known as Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the deal that the P5+1 and Iran agreed to in 2015, and the reason it was so narrow is because that's the only thing that they could agree on. If they would widen the scope of the deal, there would be no agreement to begin with. So that would be the problem. So why did we have JCPOA? First of all, let's figure out what JCPOA is. JCPOA is nothing but an arms control deal. Yep. Period. End of the sentence. President Obama signed it because he wanted to take military option off the table regarding Iran. And that's why they signed it. By virtue of decertifying it, what President Trump is doing is he is getting the United States closer to a path of confrontation with Iran, and in fact putting the military option back on the table with Iran. So all in all, what we're hearing in the media is noise. Yeah, it's pure noise. The real story is it's an arms control deal and had to be done.
Mahan, weigh in on that, because we had, as sitting as president, we had Trump sign off on it. Every 90 days, the president has to continue to be in agreement with this agreement here. And he's walking away from it. Presumably, there hasn't been an official announcement yet. But, what is driving this? Because he knows, and his advisors around him saying that Iran is compliant here. I mean, this is one of the most odd things I've ever seen an American president do. And I guess we have to all agree this is an odd president. Go ahead, in London.
Yeah, I mean, there's basically three things going on here, Peter. Firstly, there's ideology. I mean, Donald Trump is by ideology committed to confronting Iran and pushing back against Iranian influence in the region. He made that very clear in the run-up to his presidential campaign and getting nominated and finally elected November last year. So that's one thing. Second thing is his own personality, his vanity, and the fact that, he wants to somehow destroy the legacy of Barack Obama. And the JCPOA deal is the cornerstone of the Obama presidency, at least in terms of foreign policy. That's the second thing. And the third thing is, look, I mean, he has a tendency to look beyond the establishment and the mainstream in Washington, D.C. in terms of policy. So what is the mainstream input on policy on Iran, for example? It's the U.S. intelligence community, it's the U.S. State Department, and agencies such as those. And of course, all of these people, including Trump's closest advisors, as you made it clear, the defense secretary, even the Secretary Secretary of State, they've all made it clear that the JCPOA is in line with US national security interest. And as your colleague made it clear correctly, the JCPOA is effectively limited to the nuclear issue. You know, it's there to contain Iran's nuclear program for 10 to 15 years. However, Trump is transcending that mainstream. He's getting advice from quarters outside the mainstream. I mean, the pro-Israel lobby is one. Right. Also, long-time American strategists and people like Henry Kissinger. He met Trump a couple of days ago. And so it's these people Trump is getting advice from, and they're driving the overall narrative of his foreign policy. And he seems to think that grandstanding against Iran, which is America's most potent enemy. Remember, Iran and the US have been at loggerheads for nearly 40 years now. This is a very complex, tense enmity that stretches back to 1979. There are many issues here. There are many unresolved files. And so he seems to think that grandstanding on this issue will raise his profile and would make his presidency, at least in the first term, a memorable one. And he seems prepared to absorb the costs.
If he walks away from it, well, I think we'll be remembering it for a very long time for the wrong reasons. Rusbeh, if we go back to you in Pittsburgh, I mean, there seems to be this assumption that if the U.S., and it's not the only party, you know, it has other parties, including Iran, into this, walks away from it, is that they're going to force Tehran to renegotiate it. Based on what fact? Based on what logic would one make that decision that, oh, we'll make them sit down again? Why would Iran do that if it sees Washington, a new president, walk away from an agreement that the United States has with the international community? It's nonsense. Go ahead.
Well, certainly Iran will not sit down again and renegotiate. It will not happen, period, end of the sentence. But something we have to keep an eye on is decertification is a political maneuvering in the United States. Yeah. Decertification itself, I want to be clear, itself is not a violation of the nuclear deal. But what it could potentially cause is it would expand a gray zone, which means gives the ability to the Congress to impose more sanctions on Iran. And if that happens, that is a violation. So why did we have this, if you will, INARA? There was an act in the Congress legislation called INARA, which is suppose the Congress imposed it and actually in a way passed the legislation to make sure that the administration always verifies that Iran's program is still for peaceful purposes. That was for domestic consumption, but now that's coming back and hunting the Republicans, the GOP leadership, and the broader national security establishment of the United States. But all in all, there would be no new negotiations on this front. And furthermore, Europeans, other international partners the United States has, will in a way lose faith in U.S. commitment to hold international, if you will, agreements.
You know, that's exactly where I want to go. Let me go back to Mahan in London. I mean, there's the credibility issue is multidimensional here because the Europeans have no interest in walking away from this agreement. Unlike the United States, the Europeans would like to be involved in bilateral trade with Iran. I mean, after all of these sanctions, decades of sanctions, people would like to go in there and make some money, and it's a mutually beneficial agreement here. I don't think, we'll see, but I think that, you know, the Europeans are not going to bow down to this because they don't see that there's any violation on the side of Iran, and they have their own interest. And maybe for a change, the Europeans are beginning to realize they better start looking out for themselves. Go ahead.
Well, you're absolutely right, Peter. I think this could be the first crisis in U.S. Atlantic, you know, the Atlantic relationship since Suez. Look, the last time the British and the Americans disagreed on something very strongly was the Suez crisis back in the 1950s. I mean, the UK protested against the American intervention in Grenada in 1984, but that was a minor issue. But on this issue of the JCPOA, the British Prime Minister Theresa May has come out very strongly and stated that the UK is firmly committed to the JCPOA. And that is obviously completely at odds with the position of Trump and his ideological advisors. So if Trump decertifies, as he's expected to, and let's make no bones about it, decertification is effectively the end of the deal, because this is a death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, this, you know, it will begin the process where the deal starts to unravel, because Congress would ramp up sanctions, the Iranians would retaliate, and within a few years, the deal will scupper. And so should that happen, happen, you will have a very interesting situation where, yes, I mean, the mainland European powers, Germany and France, they will obviously try to salvage something from it. But the UK would be in a very precarious situation, because we haven't had this situation for a long time, where UK and US policies are so divergent on such an important issue in international relations. And I think all these countries are very worried. They're worried on the security front, because the destruction of the deal would mean greater instability in the Middle East. But they're also worried on the business commercial front. I mean, the UK, for instance, has entered into several very lucrative deals with Iran, including on solar energy. Quercus, the British company, which is now doing a multi £200 million deal with Iran. So all of these are at stake. So if the JCPOA collapses and the sanctions are imposed in earnest, then European companies would find it very difficult to do business with Iran, especially if the Americans turn around and say, hey, you choose between us or the Iranians.
Exactly.
You either do business. And of course, that's no choice, you know, because who can ignore the US?
Okay, let me go to Uzbek right before we go to the break here. I mean, the thing is unraveling of the agreement here, and I think that's exactly what the people behind this decertification want. They want to be able to claim that Iran is in violation, okay, as it unravels, and that's an intentional trap. Go ahead before we go to the break.
I don't believe it would unravel. I'm not wearing my... I don't think it would unravel. I'm not wearing my optimistic glass. But what I do think will happen is the U.S. will, in a way, be excluded from the broader, if you will, agreement with Iran. I think the Europeans, I think China, I think Russia will pull through with this. Remember, this is no longer about the United States. It's about Eurasian connectivity. Iran is on a cross center of the Eurasian connectivity. Europeans have greater stake, if you will. Russians do, and the Chinese do. So they're not going to actually go get away from this deal and ignore it altogether. And remember, talking about the financial sanctions.
Well, hang on, gentlemen, I have to go to a hard break here. After that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Iran nuclear deal. Stay with RT. Okay, at this point, I'd like to pull in a new guest here, Ian Williams in New York. He's a senior analyst at Foreign Policy in Focus, as well as author of Untold, the real story of the United Nations in peace and war. Ian, we discussed some of the elements of how the administration, the U.S. administration, may walk away from this. Let's kind of change gears and assume that it is decertified and the U.S. Walks away from this agreement. How will that affect the region? Because I would like to point out is that you hear in mainstream media, particularly in the cable stations, that really the reason behind Trump walking away from Obama's deal is, number one, because Obama signed it, and number two, quote-unquote, Iran's bad behavior in the region, okay? Well, that's like a kettle calling a pot black. Anyway, Ian, what are the implications for the region if this agreement falls apart? Go ahead.
Well, they're profound in many ways. As you just pointed out, Iran is at the crossroads of a huge region, and its actions have mostly been constructive from an American point of view. Iran cooperated over Afghanistan. It's cooperated in Iraq and tried to restrain the more sectarian approach that could have been taken. I mean, basically, they could take over Iraq politically in no time at all, but they've been collaborating. They've been collaborating over dealing with ISIS and Al-Qaeda there as well. Now, all of this can be brought to a halt if the US starts anything like covert hostilities, which is the implication here, because I have to take exception. You said, what is the Trump policy? And I don't see a policy.
I don't either.
What we see here is reflexive prejudice and pandering to prejudices from Israel and from some of the old Pentagon types who've never forgiven Iran. This is not a policy. This is a reflexive gesture of disgust which will have repercussions with all of the neighbors in the area. The Saudis might applaud, but we've already seen the US is against Europe and most of its major allies on this. It won't be able to get a United Nations justification. And even going to the American public saying, by the way, we're risking World War III or a collapse of the world oil market and the financial system because we think that Iran is not following the spirit of this agreement.
The spirit.
Yeah, show me the spirit. It's still the spirit.
Well, I mean,
show us what it is.
Mahan, if I go back to you in London, I mean, I'm just dumbfounded by that phrase. You know, Iran is violating the spirit. I mean, this is an agreement. It's written down in words. People signed it. They were all those stamps and everything. I didn't see any spirit moving around. This is nonsense. This is not diplomacy. This is just rhetoric.
Yeah,
go ahead.
But that's right, Peter. But on this issue, at least, Trump is in greater alignment with people in the establishment, including Tillerson, Mattis, and the rest, because all of these people, they try to conflate the JCPOA with aspects of Iran's regional policy, which they find objectionable. Where Trump differs with these laws, where Trump and Tillerson and Mattis diverge, is that Trump wants to do away with the deal, whereas people like Tillerson and Mattis, they want to enforce it more harshly. But at the end of the line, they all agree that they want to conflate the JCPOA with other issues. And the Europeans are not buying that. And of course, the Iranians would never buy that. And just to go back to what our colleague Ian said earlier, I fully agree with him. But however, I would say that this anti-Iran enmity in the US goes a lot deeper than people imagine. And it's not just limited to neocons or ideological crazies like Trump. There are a lot of people in the American establishment, in the Pentagon, in the CIA, retired, serving people at the fringes, at the center. They loathe Iran for a variety of reasons. And this hostility has 40-year pedigree to it. It's a very complex relationship. And I think
it's even more than complex. You're absolutely right, 100% right. But let me go to Rusbeh in Pittsburgh. It's beyond complex. It's pathological. I mean, I was a young man when the hostage crisis happened, when the revolution and all that. I remember that. And now it's to a point, it's unthinking hatred. I don't remember why I hate them, but I hate them, okay? That's what it's gotten down to. And this panders to the prejudices of the Israelis and of the Saudis and others, that they feed off of this. They feed it to Trump, you know, when Trump was in Riyadh, when he was in Israel. And I'm sure those were the two issues they talked about most with the president, is Iran, okay? When it's not in America's strategic interest to be looking for a fight with Iran. Far from it. Gentlemen, this nuclear agreement should have been a milestone to start settling those other issues. It should have been a pedestal, not the reverse. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's go back to Pittsburgh. Rusbeh.
Sure, you're right, Peter. But here's the thing. I think even if you look at it, even Israeli hawks, I'm talking about Ehud Barak, came out and said the president should not be decertifying it. What does this mean? They know the consequences of decertification could be greatly dangerous for the region. Let's remember, the deal gets decertified. If the ripple effects is intact, that means we will have more conflicts and friction points in the Sea of Oman, in the Persian Gulf, in Afghanistan, as well as Iraq and Syria and Yemen, not just with the United States, but also with Saudi Arabia. So all in all, by decertification, we are opening up a range of bad and very bad options in the Middle East. And guess who's going to be the victims of it? Israelis, Saudis as well. So the real practical, even hawks, foreign policy officials in Israel and in Saudi Arabia, they also realize that decertification is not in the best short-term and long-term interest of Riyadh and Tel Aviv.
You know, Ian, it's really kind of interesting. I guess the saying, you should be careful what you wish for, because you know, the Trump administration, they've been told, you know, by the Saudis and by the Israelis, you know, this is a bad deal, really bad deal, and they heard it during the campaign, and now Trump is going to do it. And now I think a lot of people are thinking, what? Is he really going to go that far? Because the consequences are quite great. I mean, we have to point out to our viewers here, the United States, since the Second World War, has attacked countries that can barely defend itself. It got surprised a few times with South Korea and Vietnam, but in all the other cases, these countries couldn't fight back because they were weakened through sanctions and whatnot. I don't think it's a very good idea, and people in the region know, let's not mess with Iran, because it could get really nasty for everybody involved. No one would be left untouched.
Well, I'm thinking, I want to stretch it out a bit further. Think of the implications. We have another crisis at the other end of Asia in North Korea.
Yep.
What is the signal being sent to the North Koreans? Can you talk to us seriously? Well, the answer is coming back. No, because whatever you agree to, in a few months down the line, we're going to accuse you of violating the spirit and say that Kim held his fingers crossed behind his back when he signed the deal, and we're going to come back for more. What we're saying here, I mean, is that American credibility, that American diplomacy has no credibility whatsoever. Yeah. We are not going to abide by our agreements. We might temporarily, expediently agree to things under pressure from our allies, but the very first occasion we're going to walk back on them. What lesson is that sending for non-proliferation in general, but Korea and I think the allies in the area, in the Middle East?
If I could say with Ian on this real quick here, I mean, maybe that's what he meant by the calm before the storm, because I've questioned a lot of people around me. Is it Iran and North Korea simultaneously? I don't know. Who wanted to jump in there?
But Peter, on the question of non-proliferation, one of the reasons I think that decertification is basically the start point of the unraveling of the deal is that there are a lot of people in Iran who are also opposed to the JCPOA. And so far, the Iranian government, led by President Rouhani, and the broader national security community has held these people in check. But if America now starts decertifying the deal and takes additional punitive measures, for instance, sanctions, there will be pushback in Tehran. And there are a lot of vested interest in Iran who want to start the nuclear program in earnest. And hitherto, even up to the point of the JCPOA being signed, Iran did not have a military nuclear program. There was no weaponization program. But I think if America starts ratcheting up the process, then the Iranians may go down that line, and that does pose a big threat to the whole non-proliferation infrastructure. So, and that's worth noting as well.
Rusbeh, the interesting thing too is designating the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. That also, I think that's never been done with a standing army of a United Nations member. That's a quite incredible thing to even imagine. Rusbeh in Pittsburgh, go ahead.
I spend a lot of time in Tehran, Peter. I spend a lot of time interacting with people. The problem right now is Washington is viewing the IRGC, Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a military unit. However, IRGC is not a military unit. Beyond a military unit, they are in Iran's, if you will, ideological establishment. They are in Iran's economic establishment, social establishment. Sure, there's a lot of problems with them, as there are with other various establishments in Iran. However, they are being viewed by Iranians and as a beacon of stability internally to fight ISIS, because General Soleimani, who spent most of his time outside of Iran, is being viewed by Iranians, whether the Iranian is the left or the right, as someone that in a way protected Iran against ISIS. And if IRGC was not in power, the twin attack that happened in June of 2017, we would have seen more of that. So what they are saying is, they're saying the Iranians are probably thinking that the United States is attacking our very core security and establishment. And I think the Iranians are not going to go along with this. It's going to be problematic.
Let me go to Ian here, give him the last word, because he always was only in the second half of the program. I always think that when the U.S. deals with the Middle East, it doesn't think about the consequences, the unintended consequences. And I think we're at one of those nexus points right now.
Well, very clearly. I mean, it's run by reflexes and prejudices, and we have, as people pointed out, the neocons. A lot of the Democratic establishment are equally anti-Iran as well. So, but I don't think most American people are really ready for another war in the Middle East. I mean, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. How many more wars do they want? They can't cope with the ones they've got. I mean, this is, it's a proxy war at the moment. There's Yemen coming up. I think that once people begin to realize what's behind these obscure foreign names, and that Americans will start to die. And we have to come back to the logic of this. No matter what you think of the regimes in Pyongyang or Tehran, if you are threatened by the superpower in the world with overwhelming conventional force on a daily basis,
we've run out of time.
But one thing, nuclear weapons seems a rational option.
I think we all would agree going down the path of war never makes any sense here. Many thanks to my guests in New York and Pittsburgh and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.